go pretty well for some people. And here you see more about his tax philosophy. You see Secretary Andrew Mellon, series of cutting taxes, cutting the inheritance taxes you have to pay when you inherit stuff, getting rid of the gift tax, excise taxes, and that. Now, Harding, y'all, was what we call a fiscal conservative. Now, the word fiscal, I'm going to put up here so you can see the spelling of it. Now notice it's fiscal, not physical. What a fiscal conservative is, y'all, is somebody who doesn't like spending money unnecessarily. They'll cut taxes, but they also cut spending. It's what President Eisenhower would try to do. We don't see too many fiscal conservatives, Republican or Democrats these days, do we? Republicans have their stuff they want to spend money on, armed forces and all of that. Democrats have money they want to spend on social welfare, climate change stuff, and all of that, right? But nobody anymore says, maybe we shouldn't be spending so much money going into so much debt. Maybe we should, not be doing that. But that is what he was. And he was one of the last ones that was like that, y'all. Since then, all of our presidents have been not very fiscally conservative. Even Reagan, who cut taxes, didn't necessarily, and he cut spending in some areas, increased it in other places. Now, the Roaring '20s weren't so roaring for you farmers, okay, for the farmers. Now, why is this? Well, I'll show you guys a graph here. Just like I spent y'all like 45 minutes trying to make a graph with all the cool, lines and stuff going, and it turned out to look like a pile of you-know-what. So I ended up just getting one off the web that I'll show you guys in just a sec here. Now, farmers were the group who were hurt most by the 20s. Everybody else had pretty much a good time, y'all, except the Reds and anarchists and people expected to be that. But farmers, y'all, did not get that prosperity. Why did that happen? Well, during World War I, y'all, European countries had bought a lot of food from our farmers. Why? Well, think about it. During World War I, their soldiers, their men are gone away. They're fighting on what normally would be fields growing food. Those become battlefields, cemeteries, and stuff. And so the Europeans, y'all, needed our food. And so we sold them lots of food, and we sold it to them at very high prices. So farmers, y'all, get really excited by this increase in supply. So, of course, being farmers, and I love farmers. I had uncles that were farmers and ranchers. But what do farmers do during good times? Well, they tend not to pay off their bills. They are like, hey, times are good. I'm going to buy more land so I can grow more food and sell it at those high prices. I'm also going to buy some really cool equipment that's going to help me be even more productive than I am. But then, of course, y'all, the war comes to an end. And suddenly Europeans are like, hey, we don't need your food anymore. Our men are back home. We can start growing things again. And so suddenly, y'all, you've got this high supply, but you have a decrease in demand. Prices plunge, but farmers have all these debts. So you see this modern equipment, like, for example, y'all, farmers went from having plows, which most of them were still using, y'all, believe it or not, into the 1920s, to having, of course, relatively modern tractors and harvesters and things like that. But all of that stuff costs money. And so they got really into debt. And so I didn't put this on y'all's notes, but this is why when Coolidge vetoed McNary-Hogan, the idea that you would maybe take the excess food farmers were growing that they couldn't sell and buy it and, I don't know, give it away to people, poor people or whatever, people said, man, this is awful. This is hurting us, man. You can't be doing this to it. But once again, fiscal conservative, not spending money, and didn't want to do that. Now, in the 1930s, during the New Deal, the Agricultural Adjustment Act of President Roosevelt is going to do just that very thing. It's going to basically say, hey, we know you can't sell what you got. We don't want you to waste it or destroy it, as some people were doing. We're going to buy it, and maybe we'll give it to the poor people so that they'll have it. Okay, so here's the graph, y'all. This is one I got off the web, so let's see what happens here to kind of explain it. Now, this is what's called a supply and demand curve. Now, right here is what we have. It's equilibrium price. This was the demand for American farm goods. This is what American farmers were supplying. Notice, as the price goes up, this is price over on this axis, more and more is supplied. But you and me as consumers, as price goes up, less and less is being demanded. So if the price is this, you're going to have a bigger surplus. All of this isn't going to go sold. If the price is too high, you know, up here too, once again, you're going to have an excess supply or whatever. Okay, so what happens is this, all right? Well, maybe I did include one here. Supply shifts out, okay, during the war. Suddenly, y'all, people want more American food. What's the only thing that can happen? Price is going to go up from here to here. And of course, farmers, instead of supplying this amount, which is what they were supplying, or no, instead of supplying this amount right here, y'all, this quantity, now they're supplying more. They're growing more food and they're getting more money for that food, okay? Now, what happens is when they start growing more stuff, y'all, when farmers start growing more stuff, this is what happens to their supply. Okay, I kind of got it mixed up with demand here. Or no, I had demand on here. Okay, so when their supply, because they've got better fertilizer, they've got more land, all of that stuff, tractors, y'all, the supply increases. Well, this is the trouble, y'all. If demand stays the same, and remember, demand had been up here, which was cool for farmers because price was up here. But when prices go down, when supply increases, what's going to happen to the price? Here was the price before. Here's the price now, y'all. Price is about half of it. You're growing more food, but you're getting less of it. That is supply and demand, and that's going to be about a month of your year next year, y'all, in economics. Now, unions also had a hard time in the 20s because people did not join them. They were generally a bad time for unions. Why did that happen? Why did 1 out of 5 people in a union, just after unions had become popular and kind of sort of legal in the 1910s and early 1900s, why did people give up on them? Well, a lot of people gave up on them because of the idea of companies just saying, look, we're going to be an open shop company. We are not going to be a closed shop company. Now, what open shop means, y'all, is you don't have to be a union member to get the job. If you are just, any dude can walk in, if you got the certification, if it's a special job, you can do it. But a closed shop job is one where we won't hire you unless you are a member of the union for the job. Now, like for example, Mr. D, the day after he graduated, I literally started working the next morning, y'all, driving trucks, okay? I worked at a chemical plant, I drove the trucks and all that, but to do it, it was a closed shop. I had to join the Teamsters Union. I had to pay dues out of every paycheck that hopefully someday I would see as a pension. Of course, I only did it for 4 years. I needed to do it for 5 to see any of that money. Now, companies too, y'all, went around the unions because a lot of people don't like paying their union dues. They don't like having money taken out of their paycheck. And so companies said, hey, how would you like to have some of those really cool benefits, maybe health care, maybe, some, extra time off, vacation time and stuff that normally only union jobs have. We will give you that. We'll give you higher wages, but this is the deal. You can't be in a union. And so some people are like, okay, cool. I get all the cool stuff from a union without being in a union. Now, also in the South, y'all, there had been a real effort to try to make Southern textile cloth workers into union members. Now, in the American South, gradually, y'all, companies have begun to figure out, hey, having a factory in the South is a good idea. The land is cheaper in the South than it is up north. The people there are generally not very pro-union, so we can, pay them less and treat them differently and all of that. Well, guess what? They get rid of that. And also, y'all, and I'll leave this up here, the courts generally work against the union, including good old Uncle Harry M. Daugherty, the Attorney General, and the United Mine Workers, y'all, had several things here. And the last one, y'all, is many people, because of the Red Scare, unfairly associated unions with communism, right? People didn't differentiate. Okay, folks, I realized when I was looking back that I had not done this slide, so I'm going to hopefully be able to add it on to part 1 for you guys and get it to to work there and join it together. Anyway, excuse me, my throat's nearly gone. Of course, looking at this background here, you see, of course, Babe Ruth, right? The great Yankee slugger we've talked about. You see a picture of the great Louis Armstrong from the Harlem Renaissance, from jazz, all of that. And Al Capone, remember St. Valentine's Day Massacre, the guy who made Mob and all that really big. And this is Texas Guyan back here, perhaps, I think that's Tex, one of the most famous ladies for opening a speakeasy and running that. So interesting choice of folks, you know. You've got sports, you've got the arts, you've got crime, and you've got, I guess, culture, whatever you want to say there. So let's look at education in the 1920s. Now, education, you know, there's the long sort of history of that. We've talked about it a little bit. If you go back to Massachusetts way back in the 40s, 50s, had become the first state to require kids to get a basic education. As we've said, generally speaking, males got more education than females. Northern schools, northeastern schools could do it because there were more people lived closer together, and it was easier to have a central school that kids could indeed walk to. But as you go further south, where you had larger and larger farms and you had fewer large cities or towns, that wasn't possible. And you tended to have people have to have private tutors if they were wealthy, or they had their parents teach them for as long as they could. Well, with Reconstruction, and of course the American South lagged behind in that. With Reconstruction, you start seeing the American South being required to offer free education to its citizens, which is necessary, obviously, if you want to have a smart citizenry who can be good, productive citizens, good, productive workers, and contribute to this country, make good choices when voting and things. And so by the 1920s, you're seeing things start to change. More and more states are requiring kids to go through at least junior high to age 16, okay? And high school really becomes kind of a thing. A lot of people, y'all, back in the early days, you've kind of gone through maybe, let's say, 14, 15 years old, and you went off to college. University if you were a guy or wealthy, whatever, or you learned a trade and you left school then. But we're seeing high school become a thing, and we're making people attend it. Now, early schools, y'all, might have multiple grades in there. One poor teacher, and I always feel for these teachers who were predominantly women. You know, these little red schoolhouses, we often think of them, all having to teach, like, you know, maybe one kid in 3rd grade, one kid in 4th grade, one in 5th, maybe one's a senior. I mean, it had to be a nightmare. I had to teach GED classes, and I had to teach 4 different subjects simultaneously. So I was always running to one group, talking to them for a while, running to another group, talking to them. And I think that's what it must have been like, or you really depended on some students to teach the others. So it was rough. It was rough in a lot of these schools where you didn't have many schools and you had one teacher in many different grades. But that begins to change by the 20s. We really start seeing separate grades and teachers for those individual grades, and it becomes compulsory. You have to go, which, as much as you and I hate school, you and I know it's kind of necessary. We definitely could change some things, but we kind of need it. And so the number of high school graduates doubles, all right? The 60s are going to be the real time, y'all, when we see the number of people in college graduate. And a big part of that's going to be when our soldiers come home from World War II. Unlike the delayed bonus that I think a lot of them never ended up getting. I don't know what ended up happening with that bonus that they promised in the 20s to them in 1945. After World War II, we set up the GI Bill of Rights, which one of the options that you could get, as you've heard me talk, if you've seen that on, was the chance to go to college. And they really managed to speed up college. You didn't have to take a lot of the extra stuff. You focused on your major. You got it done in maybe 2 years, and you got out of there. And we paid for it as a thank you for your service. Of course, you could also get money to start a business, buy land, or do something like that. But a lot of our guys, and it was guys, women were not offered that chance, decided to to go to college, and gave us an incredibly educated population. So you see here, this is kind of, and when I look at these pictures, y'all, of these folks, like I look at, you know, picture of my grandfather and my great uncle, they look so old. They're like old people or whatever in there. I don't know if it was just life or whatever, but here you see a graduating class of a high school. Obviously much smaller than our graduating classes. What is that, like 2 homerooms today? And the little red schoolhouse of old, shown here, right? I should have made it red. It might have 3 or 4 classes, becomes, of course, the modern giant mega school. It's kind of like Dobie in a sense, right? Except they got an entrance over here. They got a wing. This is like social studies wing. Here's like the front office. This is science and math over here, English up there. I guess that's what ours is. All righty, folks. So I think that finishes it up. At this point, you should go to part 2B, which I hope is a little bit more interesting for y'all. I will get into talking about sports, the Harlem Renaissance, some stuff about jazz, and in fact, all that jazz and more. You guys take care. Bye-bye. Happening, and that's why Mr. D talks about it. Now, another thing, y'all, that challenged a lot of people's ideas was this concept of prohibition, which lasts from 1920 to 1933. Now, remember, alcohol was banned largely as a result of the effort by the temperance movement, mainly led by women. Remember, women are often the victims of alcoholics. Their husbands don't, give them the money they need to buy food and take care of the kids. The 18th Amendment got this through. But the trouble is, y'all, when you ban something popular like alcohol, in fact, something that many people were addicted to, there are going to be people who will provide it. They will get it to you, and they will make a lot of money doing so. If there's money to be made, as we've seen in drugs, there will be people that will make or supply the drugs. The most famous of those was this guy, Alphonse Capone, or as we know him, Al Capone, right? Now, Al Capone was the mob boss of Chicago. He made sure that people got their booze, made sure that people got their prostitutes. He extorted money. And he, of course, enforced it with a Tommy gun, a 45 caliber submachine gun that people used. But there was a rival gang, y'all. And this rival gang of Bugs Moran, he decided to take out in one fell swoop. Now, he let leak information that a truck full of beer and alcohol had been caught and was sitting in a garage. So Bugs Moran people go to try to get this truck full of alcohol. Now, Bugs kind of thinks it's maybe a trap, so he stays across the street in another place. I think he actually got his girlfriend there, and he stays, but he sends in his gang, y'all. Now, it's Valentine's Day, and let's see what happens. So as the guys are there looking over the truck, suddenly a couple cops show up. Now, one of the problems of prohibition, y'all, is that with all the money being made, cops were often bought and sold. You didn't want to get arrested for having alcohol? Pay off the cops. And many of their bosses were paid, but these cops don't look like they're being bought. They tell them to line up against the wall. Even some poor guy, y'all, who's doing work on a car, they call him up.
Let's go. Sir, I'm just here. Let's go. All I do is work on the automobiles. I don't know what you do with these people.
Now, this is in a Chicago garage.
Hands on the wall.
Now, the garage was later torn down, but the wall you see here was saved. It ended up in Montreal, Canada, in a men's restroom, y'all. And I just got to say this as a guy. Some guys, y'all, when they go to the bathroom, they put their hands up on the wall like this and go to the bathroom. Well, when you were standing there, if you didn't know any better, you were putting your hands up against the wall, on the same wall where what you're going to see happened. Okay. Now, these are a couple of Al Capone's guys. Notice they're Thompson submachine guns. Cops have shotguns. These guys have machine guns. These guys think they're just being lined up to be searched, right? One dude was hit 37 times. One guy was nearly completely cut in half, y'all. Now, I would think firing that at the wall, y'all, a lot of those bullets would be flying back and bouncing back. Now, today that wall, y'all, is in Las Vegas in the Mob Museum. And guess what? Mr. D visited it. You guys have a great day, hopefully better than those guys. Take care. Have a good one. Bye-bye. Okay, so you guys just saw the St. Valentine's Day massacre. As I was saying, for a while, that wall was actually in a men's restroom in Montreal, Canada. You go into the restroom and put your hands up there right where the guys, and you can even still see the bullet holes. Today, it's in the Mafia Museum, or the Mob Museum, as they call it, in Las Vegas, Nevada. You can go there and you can see it there.
Is that you?
Now, the alcohol that people like he provided, if it was illegally made, it was called bootleg or moonshine because you made it illegally by the moon, or people called it bathtub gin. You might make it in your bathtub, and it wasn't very good. And people tended to drink in what were called speakeasies. Now, a speakeasy wasn't labeled as a bar, but that's what it was. You had to know somebody who would tell you its location. And so you would give the password when you knocked on the door and somebody would say, "Who's there?" You would say, "Well, Joe sent me here," or whatever the phrase was, and they'd let you in. And a lot of the booze, y'all, was awful. I mean, it was poorly made. And so what people started doing is they started putting flavors into it, mixing it up to try to cover the bad taste. And thus was born the cocktail, the mixed drink, okay, to kind of cover that up. Now, another feature, though, and this has been a criticism of Prohibition, even though there's positives like people do think the number of incidents of drunk driving went down, the amount of alcoholism supposedly went down, but it does have another consequence. Men wanted to take their ladies to the bars, to the speakeasies. And women, remember, had not really gone to many bars before. So you start seeing, y'all, women drinking more than you had before. That had been mainly a male vice. And you really start seeing that pop up. Plus, people tended to drink harder stuff. If you were going to be drinking, you weren't going to be just sit there sipping beer, something relatively light in alcohol. You wanted something stronger. And you were paying a lot of money on it. So people tended to drink stronger things. So those are some of the negatives that come out of it. Here you see one of those speakeasies, and some of them are quite dramatic. If the cops came in, the bartender might be able to push a button, and all of the alcohol, y'all, would slide down a wall to the basement, and then it would flip to where it'd be a nice, innocent-looking kind of place. Now, some alcohol was allowed to be made, like for church services. I think a lot more people went to church during that time, for various sacraments and things like that. And there was something called near beer, very, very light beer, that was allowed to be made. Now, it's finally the 21st Amendment that repeals it. Okay, that was the pouring of a drink, I guess.
On January 16th, 1920, the Great American Bender came to an end when the Volstead Act was signed into law and became the 18th Amendment to the Constitution. So began the Great Prohibition Era,
All the beer
brought on in part by a decades-old grassroots temperance campaign organized largely by women that had already succeeded in banning liquor in 25 states. Now the entire country would go dry. Everywhere, law enforcement officials set about enforcing prohibition by tracking down stills and stashes and disposing of them. Throughout the country, raids were made on bootleggers' hideouts, and cask after cask of bathtub gin were hacked open by eager police.
Like I said, bribery was
Unfortunately,
very common.
prohibition had many unintended consequences. For one thing, it divided the country between dries and wets.
Yep, really split the country.
Supported or opposed the 18th Amendment. For another, crime soared as people turned to bootleggers to obtain their liquor.
Everybody became a criminal who
to
drank.
A thirsty populace soon became the province of organized criminal syndicates, led by some of the most notorious figures in American history. The problems with legislating morality soon became abundantly clear as underground drinking spots, speakeasies, flourished as millions of Americans evaded prohibition and continued to party like never before. The glamour of the speakeasies proved a powerful attraction, and later research showed that more people drank during the 1920s than before Prohibition. Alcohol-related deaths increased substantially. In New York City alone, 700 people died in 1927 as opposed to only 84.
Some of the
in
alcohol was
1920.
poisonous and caused
Along the
blindness.
coast, rum fleets took to the sea to run booze past Coast Guard
Now, there was a
patrols
guy,
and
y'all,
the
who
rest
would
of the
bring in the
Prohibition
real
Navy,
stuff, not the
which
fake
was
stuff.
allowed to shoot first and ask questions later.
His name was McCoy, so they
The
called it the
bootleggers
real
and
McCoy.
organized syndicates armed themselves and operated sophisticated networks. Some, such as crime lord Al Capone, made tremendous fortunes during Prohibition. In one 3-year period, illegal alcohol sales topped $15 million. Around the nation, local district attorneys struggled with a glut of prohibition cases, which sometimes took up over 50% of their time. Law enforcement was costing the country millions. Franklin Roosevelt campaigned against prohibition during the 1932 election, and it was a stance that helped propel him to the White House. Finally, in December of 1933, the United States admitted failure and repealed the Volstead Act. Prohibition, with all its lofty moral goals, had at last come to an end.
All righty, y'all. So we're going to go ahead and stop there. Hopefully this will give you guys what you need to know. I will wrap up the rest, maybe try to record it later on after school today and get that to y'all so we can move on. All right, take care. Have a great day. Bye-bye. It was a much bigger deal. Now, the Jazz Age is the term that you guys need to associate with the 1920s. Some people call it the Roaring Twenties because of the economics. Other people, y'all, call it the Jazz Age because of the impact of this new type of music. Now, jazz, y'all, had begun in the African-American community. It is a quintessentially American thing that we developed, y'all. It comes out of the United States. You know, country music comes out of the United States. And of course, rock and roll. And I think, I'm not sure, but I think rap does as well too. So there have been some musical art forms, y'all, that really we in the United States can take credit for and take pride in. Now, so jazz, y'all, makes its way out of the black community, and eventually you start seeing white artists performing it as well. But it becomes so popular that it really characterizes the age. And this guy, F. Scott Fitzgerald, who was one of the most famous writers of the 20s, he'll die in the 1940s out in Hollywood when he goes out there to try to start writing screenplays. But he writes a lot of novels, y'all, including, of course, The Great Gatsby, which I'll show you a little bit later. But it is this book that gives the Jazz Age its title, Tales of the Jazz Age. It's a bunch of short stories that he put all together into one book. And it was Tales of the Jazz Age. And you can see here, y'all, this is the original cover when it came out in the 20s, you know, and, you know, it doesn't like today, January 1st, 1920, we begin the Jazz Age. Oftentimes, y'all, you know, you have to be in the middle of the period for somebody to write the book, write the song, or the movie that really gives name to what you just lived through. I don't know what they'll call this. Will this be the COVID age? Will it be, you know, whatever? But they'll come up with some name, y'all, and you're like, oh, yeah, I guess that's what I just lived through. So these people, y'all, lived through the Jazz Age. Now, jazz, of course, is a new form of music. It had made its way out, like I said, out of predominantly being something that African Americans listened to something that became mainstream, and everybody started listening to it. And so I'm going to share with you guys just some, and it's not necessarily a perfect choice, and it's not the kind of jazz some of you may be thinking of the 50s and the 60s with greats like Miles Davis and people like that. This is earlier jazz, y'all, and one of the great leaders of it was Louis Armstrong out of New Orleans. Now, I can remember when Louis died, and it was a sad day because Louis, y'all, was not only a fantastic trumpet player, but he had a voice like nobody else. And so I'm going to let you hear a couple pieces of his, and hopefully I think one of them you'll see later. Actually, you can see Louis singing and playing the trumpet. And then also I'm going to have some Duke Ellington in it as well, too. Now, this is all meat and no potatoes. So you hear drums, obviously his trumpet, you hear clarinet, B-flat clarinet in the background. Now later, y'all, the great Ella Fitzgerald will join him in this. It was really characterized by a lot of improvisation, right? You know, you start kind of playing, doing your own kind of thing. And that's one reason it's really so popular among musicians to be able to play it. And it really reveals, you know, anybody can learn to play an instrument and read somebody's music and play it pretty decently, right? I even learned how to do that. But the genius is being able to take that music and go off on your own and do something with it. And Louis was great at that. Now, another artist here is Duke Ellington, okay? Duke Ellington, and let's see what we got. There's the Duke. So what happens in this video is you see Duke kind of playing, and then other members of the band, you know, they come in and join him in sort of a jazz jam session. So you see Duke. Think of jazz having like a solo violin. The ladies are here. And it goes on. Let's see if we got the other one here. Okay. Now this is Take the A Train.
Let me say it on as our encore.
This is more sort of the orchestra jazz that we kind of moved to towards the 40s. Now, Strayhorn was the guy who really kind of composed this piece. And it started out just kind of as a filler piece, y'all, for a radio show. So kind of fast forward it here. You can hear the whole orchestra going. Okay, I wanted you to hear more than this stupid thing. Okay, well, sadly, I can't get that to quite work in there. Okay, here we go. I don't mean a thing.
Don't mean a thing if you ain't got that swing. I don't mean a thing. All you gotta do is swing. Makes no difference in the sweetheart. Just
all right, so you get an idea there, y'all. So hope everybody's there. Now, one of AP's favorite topics to ask you guys about is the Great Migration of the 1920s and into the 1930s of African Americans. Now, there's been a series of great migrations. The first big great migration was of Puritans who left and fled the English Civil War to come to what was then the British colonies. Now, they settled in New England, especially Massachusetts. They settled in Virginia. And of course, a lot of them, probably more than any other area, settled in the Caribbean. It's kind of weird to think of Puritans, you know, with their big hats and buckles and stuff in the Caribbean, but that is indeed true. All right, the next big great migration that AP refers to, and STAR, by the way, is the Great Migration of African Americans. Now, it begins in 1916 during World War I, when a lot of jobs open up, making stuff for the British and for the French. Remember, we're not in the war until 1917, but we start making stuff for them, you know, arms and things like that. And so a lot of African Americans left the farms, they left the sharecropping fields to go work up north in places like New York, Chicago, Detroit. Remember, I mentioned a lot of African Americans went to work for Henry Ford, who paid them $5 an hour, who gave them the same type of jobs and same sort of respect. And my camera keeps falling here today, y'all. I don't know what it is. It doesn't like my face, I guess, and I get that. Okay. So anyway, here's a little map, or here's a little.
My name is Ruben Williams. I'm
lecture about that.
History, and here's what you need to know in order to sound smart about the Great Migration. The Great Migration occurred in the decades after the Civil War and witnessed the
that's
movement
one of them, but think of the 20s as the main one.
Americans from out of the South to communities in the North and West. Historians generally talk about the Great Migration in two waves, one from 1910 to 1940, and one that lasts roughly from 1940 to 1970, when the Great Migration is said to have ended. Historians estimate that between 1910 and 1940, as many as 1.5 million African Americans migrated from the South to northern cities. The first wave of the Great Migration accompanied a flowering of Black intellectual and artistic expression that became known nationally as the Harlem or Black Renaissance. Several factors contributed to the Great Migration, including the lack of opportunity for African Americans to make a stable living in the South. Economic inequality in the form of unfair labor practices, such as sharecropping, tenant farming, and the crop lien system, compelled many African Americans to move in hopes of more equitable treatment in northern factories. The Great Migration was also an important precursor to the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. Finding little relief from racial discrimination in the North, African American civil rights leaders had to fight for full equality across the nation. In recent years, scholars have documented a reverse migration from northern cities back to the South.
All righty, so there you go. And here's a map that shows you, I gave you this map on your notes. As you can see, mainly it was north, but also a lot of African Americans went to California. And you see cities, y'all, like Oakland, across the bay from San Francisco, go from a very, very white city to a predominantly African American city, okay? And of course, this is going to continue then during World War II, when you also see a lot of African Americans again for jobs or for service stills. And there was a lot of defense work, y'all, out here in California. In fact, my mom during the war moved out to California, to be closer to my dad, who was fighting out in the Pacific out here, but also, of course, for a lot of the great jobs that were there. And you see people moved up north to Detroit, to Milwaukee, to Minneapolis. You know, a lot of these areas really did not, before the Great Migration, did not have Black populations. But this all begins to change. Washington, D.C., which is predominantly a Black city today, along with Baltimore. Philadelphia has a large Black population, as does Boston. You would have rarely seen in New England, y'all, very many African Americans, but this changes that, okay? And why do they do this? As the historian said, Jim Crow, right? Segregation. Doesn't mean things were perfect up north, by no means, right? But, you know, it wasn't as clear and it wasn't as strong a type of racism up north as you would find down in the South. And at least there wasn't the Jim Crow separation. You see this little chart here that kind of shows you the various peaks. You know, in AP, you know, except they wouldn't tell you the reasons for it. They might have you look at this and say, hey, what was happening in this country in 1865 to 1869? Well, you got Reconstruction, you got the Klan, you know. And then, of course, in 1890 to the 1900s, Jim Crow laws become legalized and supported and that kind of thing. And then you can see the other great migrations. And also, of course, lots of jobs in wartime industries, working, you know, to make the things we needed for war. And this will continue. Now, some of it kind of slows down during the Great Depression. If you could get a job, any job, you stayed there. But there were indeed some people who left and fled because of something called the Dust Bowl, where a lot of farmland gets covered up in the 1930s. I'll be talking about that next week. And a lot of people, whites and blacks, left the center part of the United States to head out west to try to get another chance at farming, because, you know, you can't raise much in dust. You can raise a lot in dirt, but not dust. Now, as the historian said too, this really is going to pave the way for the Harlem Renaissance that we'll be talking about in just a little bit. If these African Americans hadn't been up there, they might not have had that cultural freedom or been together to do this, or would have made it a national movement. I mean, I kind of hate to say it, but back in the day, you didn't really hear much out of a lot of southern cities. But you know, it's like if you can get up to New York or Chicago, our first and in those days second biggest cities, if you can make it there, then everybody will know about you. So it made a bigger, could do much more. Now, Harlem Renaissance, and you heard that historian talking, and he called it also the Black Renaissance, which in some ways is more of an inclusive term. A lot of people think, well, if it wasn't Harlem, then nothing else was happening across the country, literally, literal wise or whatever. But it was primarily centered in the Harlem area, the predominantly Black area in New York City. Now, it's a period of exceptionally when African-American creativity, music, art, literature gets noticed. Obviously, you know, great music, literature had been coming out of this community, but what happens, y'all, in the 20s is it starts getting public notice. It starts getting mainstream. You know, people outside of that community start listening to it, reading it, going into Harlem to actually partake of it and see it, okay? Once again, we've mentioned Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington. I'm going to show you, hopefully, a little excerpt of Josephine Baker. I went ahead and added her in. Let's see what we've got here, y'all. But they went in to places like the Apollo Club, which was in Harlem. It's still there to this day, where predominantly African Americans performed and African Americans watched them. And then the Cotton Club, which was predominantly African Americans, but white audiences watching it. Okay, and that was a really popular kind of place in the 1920s. Here you see the Apollo there, and there you see the Cotton Club. Now here's Louis and the great Billie Holiday singing together.
When the moon's kind of dreamy, starry-eyed and dreamy, and nights are luscious and long. If you're kind of lonely and all by your own, then nothing but the blues are brewing.
This is more blues
The
than
blues
jazz,
are brewing. When the wind through the willows blows across your pillow and tells you sleeping is wrong. If love goes a-thirsting till you feel like bursting, then nothing but the blues are brewing. The blues are brewing.
Now, her story is such a tragic one, y'all. She struggled with addiction, ultimately to things like heroin, a lot of her life, and it got her in trouble with the law. You may have seen the movie on Netflix, the U.S., I think it's the U.S. versus Billie Holiday, and it took its toll on her, the drugs, the harassment, and ultimately she passed away at a way too young age. But I remember getting a double CD set of Billie to listen to, and it's just unbelievable what that lady could do with her voice. Now, another song I'm going to play for you guys here is called Strange Fruit. It's perhaps one of her most famous, but one of her saddest songs. And I'll see if you guys can figure out what the strange fruit she's talking about is.
There's strange fruit, blood on the leaves,
Blood on the leaves.
and blood at the root. Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze. Strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees.
Those minor chords on the piano, you know.
Pastoral scene of the gallant South, the bulging eyes and the twisted mouth, scent of magnolia, sweet and fresh. Then the sudden smell of burning flesh.
Okay, obviously what she's talking about, y'all, are people being lynched, bodies hanging from southern trees. I mean, talking about the eyes bulging, the mouth twist, the blood, the smell. Beautiful voice singing about a terrible, terrible thing. Langston Hughes is another one of the great artists of this area, of this time period. Some famous books. One of the most famous he wrote, of course, is The Weary Blues here. And a female African-American writer you guys should know is Zora Neale Hurston. It's got an N there. You can't quite see it. It's hidden by that little banner on the bottom. But she wrote Their Eyes Were Watching God, which was a novel as well that comes out of it. And these are just a few, y'all. I mean, there's tons and tons of it, but I just wanted to give you guys a sample. You can obviously look up more, follow more. This would give you more than enough to be able to answer. Now, let's see if it will play Josephine Baker on here. I thought I set it up. Yeah, maybe this. Now, Josephine Baker was a popular actress in the 20s, African-American actress, who during World War II actually worked as a spy on behalf of the Allies. Now, this is definitely 20s. Well, that's Charleston. She's hilarious. I get tired of watching her. I don't know what the deal is with the eyes, y'all, but so you're hearing the jazz, you're hearing her dancing and stuff. So Josephine Baker. Now, another person you should definitely know of, AP loves to ask about it, and sometimes Star as well too, is Marcus Garvey. Now, Marcus Garvey comes here from Jamaica. He settles in New York, and there he founds an organization that will maybe not have much influence in his lifetime or in his era, but will have much influence in the 1960s in the United States, and that was UNIA, the Universal Negro Improvement Association. And this was their symbol here, which of course has been adopted as you'll see it at a lot of the protests, for example. This is a sign of Black solidarity. Also, y'all, what he really pushed in his beliefs was individual pride, Black pride, something that had been really something that African Americans had been able to. In fact, he was the first, y'all, to use the phrase Black is beautiful. Now, most African Americans at the time called themselves and were called Negroes. He is the person who really starts pushing the idea of Black and Black pride, and also, of course, for Black nationalism and Black separatism. And this is somewhat surprising because whereas a lot of people were pushing to try to end segregation, he is saying, no, 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 that's exactly what we do want. We want to be separated. We want to be economically self-sufficient. We want to make it on our own with no interference, no help, nobody holding us down, and make it and prove to it on our own. Also, y'all, he began to push the Back to Africa movement. Now, what's interesting is at one point, this had been seen as sort of a racist thing. Back in the 1820s, you had seen people like Thomas Jefferson, James Monroe, and eventually even people like Abraham Lincoln into the 1840s and 50s, pushing an idea that, well, what are we going to do when we free the slaves? They can't stay here. Well, hey, why don't we buy some land in Africa and send them back to Africa? And people like Frederick Douglass, the African-American, they was like, no, this is crazy. You know, now that we're not slaves, we're no longer wanted here. And so it had been a hateful idea at that time. And the United States had even bought a territory, a group of people had bought a territory that becomes the country of Liberia. And Liberia was a place indeed where a handful of the former slaves did go. But now he, an African-American, is pushing it. And there's a picture of him. And there's a picture of the company that he started. Now, white people had the White Star Line, the people that gave us Titanic, and there were very few blacks. There was only like one black guy on Titanic, and he had his multiracial family on board. I think he was from Haiti. But he starts a Black Star Line, and it was devoted to taking African Americans, he hoped, back to Africa. Now, but this is what's going to get him into trouble. Now, there are some people, your more conspiracy-minded people will say, well, you know, the U.S. government wanted this guy gone. He was causing lots of trouble. He was really, causing, people to question things and get upset. And they used this as a way to get him out of here. But what happened was he was accused of stock fraud, manipulating the stock, doing things illegally, and he was arrested. And because he was a Jamaican, right, he was eventually deported from this country. And the picture back behind there, I love it with his hat. Now, why he's more important, not so much in the 20s, but later on, is this man's father was a big Marcus Garvey fan and follower. And this man, of course, is Malcolm Little, better known as Malcolm X in the 1960s. He took a lot of those ideas and he took them nationwide through part of the Black Muslim movement. Things like blacks need to segregate. And at the same time that you had Martin Luther King, y'all, fighting to end segregation, in the 1960s, you have the Black Muslims and Malcolm X saying, no, we need to separate. We need to do it on our own. We don't want anybody helping us, interfering us, or getting in our way. Talking about black pride, black self-sufficiency, doing their own thing. And maybe not going back to Africa permanently, but definitely going back and exploring your roots in Africa, where you come from, and all of that. And so Marcus Garvey, like I said, he didn't have as much impact in the 20s when he was a factor here, but his ideas are going to be picked up by others and used like Malcolm X until his assassination in the mid-1960s. You see some of that. Now, Charles Lindbergh is the hero of the time. Okay, and if I don't finish this, y'all, I'll go ahead and record into 7th period and add it to it. Here he is. Now, Lindbergh, another Minnesota guy, was the greatest hero of the age. He was bigger than all the movie stars, the actors, or whatever. So why was that? Well, in 1927, May of 1927, y'all, he hopped in a plane with one propeller. No radio, no life-saving device. He had a basket kind of chair he was sitting in, and he flew for 31 straight hours. He urinated into a bottle because, of course, he didn't want to waste any space for anything like that. This was the plane he took, the Spirit of St. Louis. He named it that, even though it was built in San Diego, because the people of St. Louis
In 1927,
paid
a lanky
to
young
give him the money.
airmail pilot, Charles Lindbergh, captured the imagination of the world
There
by
he is,
attempting
taking
to
off at
fly
Roosevelt
alone
Field.
straight across the
The plane
Atlantic.
was, I'll tell you, so
His
filled
plane
with
had
fuel,
no
y'all.
radio, no
He didn't have
gauges for the
forward
gas
vision.
tanks.
The
It was
window in
called
front of him
the
was a
Spirit of
gas
St.
tank.
Louis.
Okay, the window in front was a gas tank. So he had a little telescope here, y'all, that he could look out to the side to see what was happening. When he landed in Paris, y'all, first of all, he made his way. One time he kind of fell asleep and sort of a glimmer of something kind of woke him up, and he kept going. He got over Ireland. People waved at him. He flew and he landed in Paris. Now, two guys had flown across the ocean in the other direction, but from Newfoundland to Ireland, not all the way across the Atlantic. He did it, and he did it alone. Lots of people had tried to do it with multi-engine planes, and they had died, y'all, but he did it alone. Now, he didn't stop there. This guy's career is amazing and ultimately very tragic. He flew all around the United States and the Caribbean and even down into South America, y'all, and he mapped out the passenger plane routes. So lots of times today, if you guys fly to South America, you fly to the Caribbean, you fly anywhere in the United States, you're going on the routes this guy drew up. And but then, y'all, the popularity made him a fortune. He married a cute girl from whose father had been our ambassador to Mexico. She was pretty rich. He was nicknamed Lucky Lindy. He hated that term. He said luck had nothing to do with it, but the Lone Eagle, because he flew alone. But after he marries Anne, y'all, he has this beautiful boy, Charles Augustus Lindbergh II, or Jr. And somebody crawled into the boy's bedroom one night and kidnapped him. And they wanted money. Now, this was the first of the big publicized kidnappings. And so what happens is, as the guy was carrying the baby down the steps, apparently the ladder partially broke and he fell. Okay. Now, Lindbergh agreed to pay the money. They put an ad in the paper. A teacher did. They eventually contacted the guy. They met up with the guy. They gave him money, but it was gold certificates, easily kept. And so Lindbergh was told, hey, your baby will be on this boat. Lindbergh flew all over looking for the boat, couldn't find the boat. and he paid the money but didn't get his kid back. A couple guys are driving by several months later, and one of them had to go to the bathroom. So they stop. They go out into the woods, and this is just a few hundred yards, y'all, from Lindbergh's house. And the guy starts to go to the bathroom, and he sees a little finger sticking up out of the ground. And he, of course, digs it back away, and it's the body of the baby. It still had its clothes on. Animals had ravaged it. Lindbergh identifies it. He doesn't even let his wife see it. He has the baby cremated. He flies out in a plane, and he scatters the ashes out in the ocean. Because people were so crazy about Thane, y'all, they were following him. They would have mobbed the baby site and all of that. Now, that's going to cause him to lose faith in this country. He moves to England, stays there for a while, and ultimately he will live briefly in Germany. Now, while in Germany, he's going to get very fascinated by the Germans. He's going to do intelligence reports. And sadly, he's going to conclude that there's no way that the British can win if they fight the Germans. And he's going to recommend that they make deals to make a deal with Hitler. Now, in the in the late 30s and 40s, when Europe is at war, y'all, Lindbergh will be one of the leaders of the America First Committee. Now, this America First Committee advocated that America not join the British in World War II. Don't come to their aid. If we go over there and fight, we're just going to lose planes and tanks and men. We need to let them all fight it out. And especially, y'all, he wanted the Nazis and the communists to fight and wipe each other out, not for America to get involved. Let them all kill each other. He was more worried about the Soviets. He wanted America to be ready here. But a lot of Americans took it as what? Cowardice. And like, he'd been a hero to my mom and other people like that. And people went and they found statues of him and they painted him yellow, that he was a coward. And when he asked to, and they even thought about him running for president, y'all, against Franklin Roosevelt, promising to keep America out of the war. It didn't happen, fortunately, but he was wrecked by that. Now, interesting thing, too, he wanted to live forever, and he helped develop, y'all, an early artificial heart. He tried to find ways, too, that you could make other human body parts so that theoretically, pretty wealthy people could live almost forever. None of that went very far, but it was kind of interesting that he helped develop an artificial heart. In addition, and people forget that. Later, he became a great environmentalist and died in Hawaii, where he is buried today. Now, the 1920s, y'all, are a time of sports heroes. Now, people, there had always been some sports heroes, but they were local. You went to the local baseball game, the local football game or whatever, and you might like the local guy. You read about him, but you couldn't hear about him. But by the 1920s, y'all, radio is going to be mass produced, and you'll be able to listen and you'll be able to hear games. Now, I don't know if you guys have ever listened to much sports on the radio, but you really should, okay? As a kid, when I lived in Puerto Rico, if we wanted to hear baseball games, we had to listen to them that way. And it was the same, y'all, in 4th and 5th grade. You just couldn't see baseball on TV except maybe the weekend game. But I liked it because you had to imagine the game. The sportscaster would have to tell you what was happening on the field, and you would use your brain to remember it. And I really have fond memories of those days. So the thing is, y'all, you could be in the middle of nowhere, out in the middle of Kansas, and you could listen to a Yankees baseball game, and you could learn about this guy, Babe Ruth, the Sultan of SWAT, number 3 on the, number 3 was his number on the Yankees. And the Yankees, y'all, were the first team to adopt numbers for their players. Now, he had an amazing life story. Had lived in an orphanage, had started playing baseball through the work of his, I think, the father there, and just was a natural at it. Okay, he played for a while for the Red Sox. He was a pitcher. Okay, but and he was a good pitcher. But the trouble is, they wanted him to play every day, right? And pitchers have a tendency to get hurt and injured and all that, so they moved him out to right field. And when they made the decision, y'all, to make the baseball more live, so the ball would go further, this guy was the king of the home run, ultimately hitting 60 home runs in a single season. It took a long time for that record to be broken, y'all, and he was the only guy I know that's broken, I think, that wasn't on steroids, right? You guys, I don't know, you may be too young to remember, but we had all these baseball records being broken back 20 or so, 15 or so years ago, y'all. And it turned out a lot of the players were all juicing themselves, y'all. This is what his steroids were. He would have like, 2 or 3 beers before the game, like a dozen or half a dozen hot dogs, maybe a hamburger, and he would go out onto the field, y'all. And just think if this guy had taken care of himself, if he had been trained, what he could have done. And his record of 715 home runs, y'all, stood until the great Hank Aaron broke it in the 1970s. There's old Yankee Stadium.
On September 30th, the next to last day of the season, and needing just one more home run, he faced Tom Zachary of the Washington Senators.
The first Zachary offering was a fast one which sailed over for a called strike. The next was high. The Babe took a vicious swing at the third pitch ball, and the bat connected with a crash that was audible in all parts of the stand. While the crowd cheered and the Yankee players roared their greetings, the Babe made his triumphant, almost regal tour of the pad. And when he embedded his spikes in the rubber disc to officially homer 60, cats were tossed in the air, papers were torn up and tossed liberally, and
incredible ball player, and there's all kinds of stories about him, and I'm just going to mention one. They were playing the Chicago Cubs, I think, one year, and one time, and there were a lot of people, y'all, who used racial epithets at Babe. Now, he was a white guy, but some people believed he has to have some black blood in him or something. And so people were calling him the N-word, including the pitcher he was facing. And Babe looked at the pitcher, and he pointed his finger at the pitcher, and he said, "The next pitch, I'm knocking down your," and he used the F-word, throat. Now, people in the stands didn't hear that, but they saw Babe pointing, and they're like, he's calling a home run. He's calling a home run. And Babe tried his best to hit the guy, but instead he hit the ball over the fence for a massive home run, okay? And you saw that. Okay, so now Red Grange was the first famous football player. Now, today football is such a big, big deal. It's hard to believe it wasn't a big thing back in the day. But to be honest, y'all, football was kind of like a poor man's rugby back in the early days. The only passing you could do would be like little laterals. It was a handoff game. But what happened, y'all, was they changed the rules and they allowed the forward pass. And this guy was absolutely amazing. He lived a long, long time. I can remember I was in college, I think, when he finally died, okay? But he ran, he scored touchdown after touchdown after touchdown. And he alone, y'all, made football start to become popular. Of course, it's not going to be super big until the 1970s and 80s and television and all of that. But
one Illinois man, suddenly as famous as Babe Ruth and Nana War combined.
Nana War was a great.
The opening kick. It goes down. Red Grange has the ball. It cuts back across the middle of the field. He's in the clear. What a way to start a game. Red Grange, Illinois, touchdown.
They called him the Galloping Ghost.
Grange around right in. He couldn't make it. Cut back in the stuff. He's playing. Oh, Grange is clear. 2 touchdowns already from the flat from Wheaton.
Notice no spiking in those days. You just had to set the ball down.
And off to Grange. He will score again. Michigan keeps choosing to kick off. Grange keeps.
3 returns for touchdowns.
Red Grange around right in. He cuts back. He's clear again. He's going to score again. Red Grange, 4 touchdowns, 12 minutes to the first. Touchdown number 5. No football player has ever done anything like this. Grange looks for an opening around left end. He spins, keeps his balance still on his feet.
That's another game. It's nice and nutty the way football should be. Okay, so you get the idea there.
One man.
Okay. And then this guy here, Jack Dempsey. Now, Dempsey, y'all, was known as the Manasseh Mauler, okay, because he came from the town of Manasseh. Now, he learned to fight, y'all, not in any fancy boxing school or anything like that. He learned to fight in the bars. Now, he was a poor kid, and he would go into a bar and he'd say, I can lick any single man in here. And so people would come up and start fighting him. He usually beat them, and when he did, he'd pass around a hat to everybody in the bar to give him some money. And that is how he made his living. Sometimes he got beat up, and he had to leave and crawl, take care of his wounds and all of that. But he was a mauler, y'all. He wasn't so much a boxer as a hitter and beater, okay? But he was the big star, and people loved his story that he came out of nowhere. He was a poor person who became wealthy. He had his own restaurants and chauffeurs, and people loved listening to boxing matches on the radio.
In the history of boxing, there have been many champions who have lost their title and tried to come back and regain their championship in return bouts, particularly in the heavyweight division. In 1927, Jack Dempsey made the attempt against Gene Tunney. 1 year earlier, Dempsey was dethroned by Tunney, losing the unanimous 10-round decision. Now here in the second fight, Tunney is again winning on points. In the 7th round, Dempsey suddenly tags Tunney with a tremendous blow. Tunney goes down, but referee Barry will not start the count until Dempsey goes to a neutral corner. Here, in one of the most controversial moments in the history of boxing, many believe that Tunney was given an extra 4 to 6 seconds to recover from the blow. Tunney gets up and continues to outbox Dempsey the rest of the way to retain the title. In June of
Okay, so there you go. So we'll talk about that's the so-called long count here in just a sec. All right, some other sports heroes. Now, women, y'all, in the 1920s were not really supposed to even be much in sports. That was considered unladylike. In fact, y'all, when bicycles came out, that was like, well, maybe we can let them ride a bicycle, but we'll have to change the bicycle slightly, and they'll need to have an exam before they go out and they do this. There just wasn't an interest, and there wasn't really permission for women to be in sports, but there was swimming. And Gertrude Ederle, who was just a little bit older than you ladies out here, decides to do something absolutely amazing. She swims the English Channel. And not only does she become the first woman to swim the English Channel, she breaks the record by a couple of hours. Now, the English Channel, in case you don't know, is 26 miles from England to France, from Dover to Calais. It's cold, rough water. And you can see she had to put this like oil and stuff all over her body to keep her body temperature from getting too low while in the water. So here's a little brief video about her.
I just knew if it could be done, it had to be done, and I did it. These were the words of 20-year-old daredevil Gertrude Ederle after she became the first woman to swim the entire length of the English Channel. Braving rough seas, frigid water, and stinging jellyfish, the American lass made the trip from France to England in 14 hours and 31 minutes, breaking the established men's record by more than 2 hours. After the feat, Ederle was honored with a ticker-tape parade down New York's Fifth Avenue.
I mean, that was an amazing accomplishment then and still is to this day. Now, Bobby Jones was the closest thing to a Tiger Woods they had at the time, but he too struggled, y'all. If any of you have ever played golf, and Mr. D played golf from the time I was a little boy until I quit, probably, I don't know, about 15 years or so ago. And I never knew how really to cuss until I started playing golf. You know, I mean, I threw clubs, y'all. I broke clubs. I was such an evil, awful golfer. You know, nothing like golf is frustrating. Same thing with Bobby Jones as a young person. He would get frustrated and his temper got to him. And it was finally when he learned to control his temper, y'all, that he became the greatest golfer of his time. He did what nobody until Tiger Woods did, which was to win like every single match. Now, you saw Gene Tunney. Now, Tunney had defeated Dempsey and dethroned him. And then when they had the rematch, you had that incident happen. Now, Tunney, y'all, was actually a Shakespeare scholar. When's the last time you ever heard of a boxer, y'all, that was like, could be a college professor and knew Shakespeare that well? He was a brilliant, brilliant man. He studied carefully Dempsey in the films, and he learned how to defeat him. Even though he might not have the size, he learned and he used his brain to be able to defeat him. Now, Dempsey, y'all, in his training, when you knock somebody down in a bar, you stay over them in case they get up, and then you hit them again, right? Well, that's why when he knocked him down and Tunney just stayed there and Dempsey went to the same corner. Well, the ref's like, dude, you got to go to a neutral corner. You got to get to the other side of the ring. And then he makes his way over there, and Tunney used that as a breathing spell and went on to win by a decision. it's still the famous long count, because instead of 10 seconds to knock him out, the guy ended up getting about 14 or 15. Now, Kenny said he was just resting and getting ready. But you saw that one. Here we go. And then finally, we had Bill Tilden. Mr. D's a tennis fan, I got to admit, and nobody was as dominant in tennis as he was. But check out how they used to dress for tennis, y'all. I don't know, you got kind of tennis shoes, but they're wearing flannel, white pants. They're using those cool sweaters. And I tell you, y'all, it was hot back then. I mean, I sweated my you-know-what off playing tennis in shorts and T-shirts. I can't imagine these guys. And look at their little wooden rackets. But he was absolutely unbeatable, okay? He also turned out to be gay, and that destroyed his career when a lot of that information began to come out as well, too, okay? But absolutely amazing tennis player of his time and dominated it. And so radio, y'all, made these people this kind of sports heroes that you and I have today. And of course, television is going to, in the 60s and 70s is really going to make these guys into virtual gods. But the greatest of all athletes, y'all, has to be Jim Thorpe. And I include him especially for my father, because my father, just absolutely worshiped and loved this guy. And it's partially because, well, he was from Oklahoma and he was Native American, like my father was part Native American. And here he is playing for Carlisle. Now, he went off to this Indian school. This was all part of the assimilation that we expected Native Americans to do. Send them to the school, teach them only English, don't learn their native languages, learn to fit in the white man's world. And he saw people playing football, and he thought, hey, that's kind of interesting. Maybe I can do it. Well, yes, he could. And he not only turned out to be good at football, y'all, he was good at everything. Now, back in the day, we used to have a 5-man event at the Olympics called the pentathlon, right? He won that. He won the decathlon, which you have to do everything in the sports decathlon, y'all. You got to run, you got to swim, you got to do whatever. And he won that in the 1912 Stockholm events, okay? And there you just see some pictures of him, okay? There you see him at the event with this Olympic shirt. And there is the king of Sweden giving him his thing. And he can't see it here, but yeah, he recognized him there. And when he got the award, y'all, when he got the medals, he said, thanks, King. He went on to play college and professional football, scoring 2 touchdowns, 92 and 97 yards. That was an amazing accomplishment. He also played professional baseball. He played professional basketball, y'all. There you see him playing baseball in the early days. But then, y'all, and this is where the story gets so sad. Back in the day, to be an Olympic athlete, you had to be an amateur. If you had ever taken money for sports, you were, quote, a professional. Well, it turned out way back in the day, he had taken what was the equivalent of about $400 or $500 to play baseball in the minor league. When they found this out, they're like, oh, that means when you were in the Olympics, you were not an amateur, you were a professional. And they took away all of his medals. They were not returned, y'all, until many years after his death. This destroyed the man. My father used to see his trailer out there, and Thorpe drank himself to death. And in 1983, the medals all came back. All right, we'll stop there, y'all. I'll record some of the movie star stuff for y'all so you guys can have this. I hope you kind of enjoyed a little bit of this. I hope you guys have a good, long 3-day break. Take you some care, y'all. All right, so movies, y'all, really become a big deal in the 1920s. They're more like, in some ways, the movies you and I have today. Although, of course, they really had to go to the theater. There was no such thing as TV, obviously. People were working on TV, but it still was a ways away. And in the early 20s, y'all, most of the movies were silence. Okay, they didn't call them that because they didn't know there was any other way. And it was really hard, y'all, to try to have a soundtrack. So when you went to a movie in the 1920s, especially in the big cities, y'all, it was an awesome experience. They were called them movie palaces. And we used to have one kind of sort of still here in town, River Oaks, that recently closed. We had one over in Pasadena, the El Cortez. I'm trying to remember what it was called. But you would go in, and oftentimes, y'all, they would have somebody waiting for you dressed in a nice, cool little suit with a neat little hat, and they would have a light, a little flashlight. You would show up, and they would take you to your seat and sit you down and everything like that. And then later on in the 30s, the movies would actually have newsreels to let you hear the news, maybe some cartoons, and then maybe a movie. In the 20s, they might help you find your seat, but the better theaters, y'all, would always have somebody playing piano. Now, if it was a really fancy theater like in New York, man, they might even have an orchestra. And a couple of times, y'all, I've been lucky enough to go to some movies from the time where they actually had an orchestra there. And to hear live music, right, by incredible musicians with a movie, a great movie, it's an amazing experience, okay? And then I've even been to them, y'all, where some poor dude would play piano. And maybe sometimes people might do sound effects. Because trying to get the track lined up, people tried to record records and play the record while the movie was playing. It just never really worked out. So most movies were silent in the 1920s. You would just see them, and they had little cards that would pop up letting you know what happened. So you would watch them. The actors, by the way, y'all, were usually from theater, right? And you guys know, if any of you are actors and actresses in theater, you guys know that you got to overact, right? You got to over project your voice. You can't do it like you do in a movie or TV show. You got to be out there in front. You got to be saying it loudly. You've got to be very demonstrative in your gestures, because some people are way in the back and may not see it. So when you and I watch the 20s movies, they're a little bit overdone, right? But once again, they felt like they had to communicate their thoughts, their expressions during this time. Now, the greatest male star, the sex star of his time, was this guy, Rudolph Valentino. I had another picture of him back here, but here he is here with his cigarettes. Cigarettes, of course, very popular then. Nobody knew that they would be bad for you. So surprising. I mean, inhaling smoke could be bad for you? Who would have thunk it? But anyway, y'all, he had been an Italian valet. He'd worked, you know, in a parking place. Somebody discovered him. And he didn't speak very good English. He was Italian. He had a terrible accent, but it's silent. All you had to do was look good and be sexy. So this is what the ladies wanted, y'all. Now let's see if and there's another picture of him. Now here's some scenes from one of the movies. Now obviously soundtrack has been added. So in real life, you would have just heard somebody probably playing piano. Now, women, please do not attack the screen. He is dead. Of course, you got a lot of stereotypes. Now, this is either the Sheik or the son of the Sheik. I get them mixed up. There was the Sheik, and it was a super big hit, so they made one called the son of the Sheik. He played both. He's getting serious now here, y'all. He's taking one of his 4 robes off. Ooh. This is pretty riveting. Oh. Anybody around? This is the actress Lucien Littlefield. He's Gaston, the French ballet. He's not even a candlestick. Why have you brought me here? Am I not a man? I've always wanted to be able to read lips, y'all, to see what they're really saying. Like, your breath is awful. You are so ugly. You are the most beautiful in the world. get the idea, but you could probably find it online somewhere. The sheik, or son of a sheik, or son of something. All right, now he will die, y'all, of appendicitis. Do what? Okay, so he has his appendix burst and he dies like a young dude. The lines were miles long to his funeral. I kid you not, this is not exaggeration. Women committed suicide. Now, his girlfriend, wife, Paula Negri, she fainted not once, but like 5 times at his funeral. For every time, like there was a camera around, like, and she would faint because she was just so heartbroken to lose this sexy man. Okay. Now, if you were a guy and you like the ladies, well, Clara Bow was your person. And there is Clara Bow, right? She was considered the it girl of the time. Now, they really couldn't say the word sex then, you know? So they would say, you know, well, she has it. Well, what do you mean it? Well, you know, she has it, meaning sex appeal, right? And so she was the it girl because she had it, sex appeal. Now, let's see, why isn't your video playing of sex appeal here? Let's see here. So this is the movie called She's Got It. So here's the movie guy out there. He's trying to find a girl with it to be the next movie star. Well, she's already a movie star, but she's playing a girl with it. None of these girls have it. I've never seen it. She's got it. I mean, she is cute. You gotta admit it.
She's got it, and plenty of it, brother. She's got it. I never saw another have so much of such
Ooh,
and such.
check out those
Well,
ankles.
she's really not exquisite, but after all, what is it? Lips and eyes, just like a million others.
See the new
Still
flapper
one
girl?
made me
She's maybe kind of wearing an undergarment.
Why, it ain't that, and that ain't it. That is that, and it is it, and she's got it. That's all.
Oh, this is cute. Got an amusement park. This thing's spinning, you gotta kind of walk through it. Out there in the car, getting in trouble. Okay, so there you go. Now, this next scene, I admit, is going to be a little bit hard to watch, okay, for modern audiences. But it's an incredible big deal, and it's something they expect you guys to be able to know. Now, in 1927, the first movie with sound for part of it. Now, it was not the first completely talking sound. That was a movie, and oh, that's a hilarious movie, y'all, because the microphones were ginormous, and they didn't have all the fancy stuff they do today. So they would have the microphones like hidden in plants, and you would see people like, so when are you coming over? You know, I mean, it was just so obvious they were talking to the mics. But in this movie, y'all, it's mostly silent. And then suddenly, if you've been watching it, boom, there's sound. And it's called The Jazz Singer. It comes out in 1927. And it's about a Jewish guy who is a great singer. His dad wants him to sing the more traditional Jewish things in the Jewish temples, right, in the synagogue. But he wants to sing on Broadway. He wants all of that. And so he ends up doing a little bit of both. But he comes out, and in those days, y'all, like I said, this is going to be uncomfortable to watch. He's going to come out, and he's going to sing Mammy. And it's in blackface because that's what they did. Some of those people did in those days. So this is uncomfortable for us to watch these days, but it is important for you to see the first time people heard people, not live, but recorded on film. So you're watching the movie, and suddenly, boom, there's his mom and dad. Oh, ouch. So once again, white guy, blackface.
Sometimes deep, sometimes wet. I know where
was entertainment. People liked that. It became an incredibly successful film. And as a result of that, y'all, they started including more and more sound in movies. Like I said, culminating into finally sound being all of them. Now, the trouble was this, y'all. Not every actor or actress had a good voice, right? And so, like Clara Bow, she had a really obnoxious accent, you know, she was like from the north and everything, and people really hated hearing her voice. And so her job was over. And then one guy who they didn't like, they distorted his voice, named John Gilbert, and his career was wrecked. People didn't like him, so they tweaked his voice on the recording, and he sounded awful. So his career was done. So you start seeing acting change. They don't have to be so dramatic or anything because people can hear them. You lose the title. Yeah, we don't need to see that anymore. Okay, so a lot of the actors could not make the transition from sound or silent movies to what we called talkies. Talkies were movies that had sound, right? So there you go. Now, the weird thing is this, y'all, you know, movie stars, their lives and stuff had always been a little bit more dramatic than yours and mine. I mean, you guys know that. I mean, you think of the movie actors and actresses today, their big cars, their houses, their, you know, it seems like they have a new boyfriend or girlfriend every week. You know, divorce is sort of a joke. You know, when they say you'll be together forever, I think they kind of laugh or do their fingers like that. Well, in the 1920s, y'all, there were some crimes and some sex scandals, and I'm only going to mention 3 of the most famous. Now, Fatty Arbuckle, yeah, that was his nickname. He was a large man, and he got larger as time went by. He gets involved at a big drunken party with some actresses, and people are all drunk, and allegedly he raped a woman, and allegedly because of his large weight, she ended up dying as a result of that. I don't want to get into any more of it than that. It's a really gross thing. You can look up some more. It turned out most of the story wasn't true, but the story was out there. His career was over, and he had been one of the funniest people ever around. He never really got much work after that. So people are like, oh my gosh, what's happening? There's rape. There's all this stuff going on in Hollywood, drunkenness and that. And then, oh, this is such a great story. I just bought another book on this that came out a few years ago. William Desmond Taylor. Now, he was like the big actor of, I mean, well, he'd been a big actor. He was Irish, but he was the big director of his time. His movies, y'all, made a fortune. Well, one night, one of his girlfriends, one of his many girlfriends, Mabel Normand, leaves the bungalow, the nice little place he's living. All right, somebody hears some stuff. The valet comes in the next morning and finds him face down on the ground. A crowd gathers. Somebody says they're a doctor. They go up to him. They look at him. I think maybe he's on his back. Yeah, maybe he's on the back. And the guy checks and says, oh, he died of stomach problems. I'm like, oh, okay, that's cool. Well, then somebody rolls him over and they notice there's a bullet hole in the back. He didn't die. Well, maybe he died of stomach problems after getting shot. I don't know. But he had been shot. Well, there have been books, there have been TV shows, there's been movies that have all tried to solve it. It is still an unsolved murder. But when they started looking at it, y'all, they found out drugs were in his past and the past of his actors and actresses. He might have even been dating one girl and her mother. Yeah, right? Gross. Now, once again, it's typical Hollywood. We hear one story, and then when you look at it, well, no, that part didn't turn out to be true, maybe or not. And this one girl was 19. He was like 50. She'd sent him a bunch of love letters. The love letters got published. She always played this really innocent kind of girl in movies, but she couldn't play innocent anymore after these letters were published about her desiring this 50-year-old dude, right? It was just kind of gross. And of course, all kinds of things. I don't want to get into them. All kinds of kinky, weird sex stuff. Well, it got all publicized. Well, if you're an average person back at home, you know, kind of religious, and you hear stories about this, about Hollywood, you're like, oh my gosh, these people are destroying us. They're awful. And then there were several very famous drug cases. Now, you know, drugs are a lot more common, and I'm not saying they're accepted, but they're more accepted today than they were then. This was really shocking, y'all. This guy had been a race car driver. He was a super popular actor by the name of Wallace Reed. And he got hurt in a movie doing his stunts. And so they gave him morphine for the pain. Well, he kept taking it, and he got addicted to it. So finally it got bad enough that they put him in in a place for treatment away from the cameras where nobody would find him. Well, he died while recovering. And there were 2 or 3 other cases. So what does this mean? Well, it means we're going to have to fix Hollywood. But if that weren't bad enough, y'all, in 1919, it was actually the next year, 1920, we found out, y'all, that the World Series had been fixed. Now, that's the national pastime. Baseball, y'all, was the sport. Football was kind of forgettable. I mean, it was starting to get popular. Forget professional basketball. And soccer, people thought that means you hit somebody, okay? People had no idea about that. So what happened, y'all, baseball is the big thing. Now, in 1919, the Chicago White Sox were the best team. Nobody could come close to the White Sox. Now, they played a weird thing. I think they played 8 or 9 games for the World Series. Back then, it was kind of funky. And all the money, y'all, was on the White Sox to win. Well, a rich guy in New York decided, hey, I can make money by betting on the Cincinnati Reds. Nobody thinks the Reds have a chance to win this. So what did he do? He approached one of the players, who then approached the other players and got them to throw games. Now, it was kind of tricky. You couldn't make it too obvious. They had to win a couple. They had to lose a couple. Some of the players didn't want to participate, but ultimately 8 of the players agreed to take the money. One of the most famous was a baseball player by the name of Shoeless Joe Jackson. They called him Shoeless because one time he played without shoes. He was kind of poor. He wasn't super bright, but he was probably the greatest baseball player of the early 1900s, y'all, before Babe Ruth really gets going. But the thing is, he took the money, y'all, but he batted like 400 or 500 during the thing. He didn't screw up any throws, but sometimes, y'all, it was so bad. In fact, one guy was watching the game, a broadcaster, and he started smelling a rat. And as he was keeping score, he would circle all the plays that he thought were suspicious. Guys dropping balls, balls just not getting to him, outfielders running slightly, guys striking out on awful pitches and stuff. And so when it came out in 1920 that these guys had taken money, they decided to go really tough on them. None of the 8 ever played baseball again professionally. A lot of their careers were wrecked. Shoeless Joe, even though he should be in the Hall of Fame, because he took money, he will probably, well, it's going to be hard to ever get him in there. And there's this famous moment, y'all, after the trial. Some people think it's apocryphal, but as Joe was leaving the trial, a little boy who worshiped him like so many people would worship sports figures in the 1920s, y'all, he sees him, and this is what happens.
Well, that wasn't so bad, was it, Joe? Kind of felt good to get it off my chest.
Did the right thing, Joe. Basically, the thing that he was.
Hey, what'd you say, Joe? Were you in on it? What's the story, Joe? Come on, who was the big cheese? Who did all the brain work? Why'd you wait so long to spill it, Joe? Hard guy. Was as sweet as a hard guy.
Joe. Say it ain't so, Joe. Say it ain't so.
So the story is the little boy says, say it ain't so, Joel, or so it isn't so, right? And apparently the apocryphal story goes, Joe looked at the kid and said, it's so, kid. You know, he broke his heart, and America's heart was broken. In fact, if baseball can get fixed, what the heck is left, right? And so many people lost some faith in popular. So what baseball did, y'all, is they hired what became known as the commissioner, the czar of baseball, to clean it up, to kick these guys all out. But, you know, there were other stories, and I did a bunch of study of baseball a couple of years ago, y'all, the early days, and there were other cases of probably bribes, teams intentionally losing games and stuff, but they hid that, right, in the 20s, and these guys became the real fall guys for baseball, okay? So what happened? Well, with the death of these guys, y'all, and actresses and drug deals and all of that, they brought in somebody, Will Hayes, to be like the baseball czar, but he would be the czar of Hollywood. And they created a production code which remained in effect, y'all, until the 1950s. And it said things like, okay, you can't have people kissing, or if you do have them kissing, no French kissing. And if they kiss, the kiss can last only so many seconds. You can't have a couple in bed together unless one foot, one leg is on the floor. So you used to see shows, y'all, where it's American, and this confused me. I used to think there was something wrong with my parents as a kid, because I would watch these old movies and I would see married couples with 2 beds. And then I would go see my parents who had 1 big bed. I'm like, why don't they have 2 beds like those people in the movies, right? It was just funky. And also, y'all, people had to sign moral clauses. Hey, if you get, you know, some weird sort of story, pictures of you nude come out somewhere, maybe you get a divorce, you're caught, you know, drunk, or you have a drug problem, we're going to fire you. And in those days, y'all, they had a contract system. You didn't sign per movie. You signed with the studio, and what they would do is, all right, Betty, we have a movie for you. Well, if I don't want it, well, that's 1 strike. You strike, you say another movie we give you, you don't want, you won't be working anymore for us. You would get paid, not per movie, but basically because of your contract. Here's a movie. And they worked them like crazy, y'all. I mean, some of them got very rich, but they worked these people ridiculously large number of hours because they were contract players and they had to take the movies that were given to them. Now, also, like I said, so they told them, y'all, they would have to self-censor the movies. And to this day, when you guys go see a movie, at least at the theater or whatever, you guys know it has a rating on it. R, you know, PG, PG-13, or maybe even G. I can't think of any G movies anymore. Hopefully you haven't seen the X ones too. But the thing is, these movies are rated. People watch them, they score them, and then, you know, the movies get released as an R, whatever. Now, that starts in the 1960s. But the reason Hollywood did that is they were fearful that the government would censor them. If we don't self-censor, if we don't start saying you can't have that in movies, you can't do that in movies, then the government's going to come in and they're going to censor us themselves. And also to monitor the employees, to make sure there's no more publicized cases of like Arbuckle or twisted, dirty kind of William Desmond Taylor murder stories, or Wallace Reed drug addictions and stuff like that. Baseball tried its best to clean up its acts, but man, some of its players too, y'all, were notorious for some of the things they got involved in. You know, Babe Ruth, who you hear me talk about on the earlier thing, Babe Ruth was notorious, y'all, for drinking and smoking and doing all that right before a game, y'all. You know, give me multiple hot dogs, have a couple beers, do all this, and then go out and play, you know. And then you can imagine what he would do after the game if that was the pre-game ceremony, okay? So you get that. Now, the 1920s, y'all, are known as the lost generation as far as a lot of the artists. This is a term that F. Scott Fitzgerald, the man who wrote The Great Gatsby, coined, okay? Now, there's an old 1970s movie of Great Gatsby, which I love. It's one of my favorite films. I love Robert Redford. I love Mia Farrow and some of the people in it. It's beautiful music. And then, of course, there's the more recent Leonardo DiCaprio version, which is beautiful to watch, but ironically, it's got like rap music.
Single person.
Who has no Gatsby?
Oh, he's my neighbor.
So here's the original.
Oh, Gatsby.
I ain't got time for you, baby. Either you're mine or...
Am I playing the right one? That's like the wrong sound. This is the more recent one, I think.
Mr. Gatsby, I'd like to know exactly who are you anyhow?
So the story of Gatsby is just fascinating because he's a poor boy and he loves this girl, Daisy Buchanan. But Daisy's a rich girl, and rich girls don't marry poor boys. So what does he have to do? He's got to become rich. And of course, when he becomes rich, he's already married, and he just has these great parties that he doesn't even really get to attend. Yeah, this movie was kind of over the top, but there's the lovely Daisy.
Gatsby. He had a grand vision for his life since he was a boy. I'm gonna fix things just the way they were before. Just you and me. No amount of fire could challenge the fairy tale he had stored up in his heart.
Oh, it's an amazing book, y'all. There's like a lot of modern music that I really like, but not necessarily.
I had the uneasy feeling that he was guarding secrets.
I wish I'd done everything on earth with you.
And I mean, it's got a great ending too. If you ever get a chance, so we saw that. Okay. Now, here is the quote, right, that gives us the term lost generation of the 1920s writers and artists and stuff. You know, I don't know if he, you know, the show looked like he'd been in the war. I can't remember if he actually had or not, but he said, here was a new generation. He's talking about his generation, shouting the old cries, learning the old creeds, destined to finally go out into that 30 great turmoil to follow love and pride, dedicated more than the last to the fear of poverty and the worship of success. And then here's the line that everybody remembers, why I'm having you guys write it. Grown up to find all gods dead, all wars fought, and all faiths and men shaken. Man, that's pretty depressing, but amazing writing. And so that's where the term lost generation comes from. Now, who were some of these people? Well, his good buddy, Ernest Hemingway, who wrote The Sun Also Rises, The Farewell to Arms, incredible books, very, very different from his friends, right? But I love me some Ernest Hemingway. Sadly, Ernest Hemingway, like, well, Fitzgerald drank himself to death. He drank himself to death, and then finally, well, before he died, he shot himself to death just to make sure, okay? Sinclair Lewis, who a Minnesota writer who was the first American, y'all, to win a Nobel Prize in literature, which was a serious thing. You know, that's a big, big thing. And what he did in his wonderful novels is he attacked a lot of the society, what people were doing, the rampant consumerism, the fact that all people cared about was making a lot of money and doing stuff like that. And so in his novel, Main Street and Babbitt, he went after this kind of life, y'all. He was a great social critic, but he did it in writing novels, not in, you know, editorials or stuff. So you have him. And then the playwright Eugene O'Neill, who did some pretty strong plays with some very sexually charged themes and some things like that that were very shocking at the time. You got to remember, this was a lot more innocent time than you and I live in today, where like anything goes. I don't know, would get a play banned today, y'all, but people went after his. They tried to censor him and all of that. But these were the great young writers. Now, when you watch the other video, I mentioned one of the great African-American women writers and male writer as well. So you see there's some incredible writers of the 20s, y'all, and I just mentioned a few of these guys. Now, in art, you have some interesting art. I like a lot of the art of the 20s, but people are moving away from the more realistic art. Part of it being, I think, the invention of the camera, right? Why should I try to paint a picture that's exactly, because the camera can do it better, right? Let me try to capture something different that the camera won't show, okay? And so you're seeing more of that in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s with Impressionism and stuff. But then we get Edward Hopper. Now, I could look at Hopper pictures all day. He's one of my very, very favorites, and I think that says something sad about Mr. D, because Hopper's pictures are always about loneliness. The people are usually by themselves. They're looking outside. They're usually in the city, and it's like, you know, they're just depressed looking kind of people. And it'll be women, and even if there are 2 people, 3 or 4 people in the picture, y'all, they look very alone. Now, he used his wife, a beautiful woman with red hair, in a lot of his pictures, but they were always separated, or she was alone. And in one of his last pictures, they're holding hands. So, kind of neat. There you see, you know, the man is face down, the wife is just sitting there. Aren't those depressing? Yeah, Mr. D loves those. Okay, and then this is his famous Nighthawks. Okay, you've probably seen this picture. Now, here you go. There's his wife as a model. This is in the Chicago Art Institute. I was telling Mr. Janis, I was trying to convince him the other day, you've got to go to the Chicago Art Institute. He's like, well, I want to go do this. I said, you got to go. And he went. He's like, that was so awesome. I'm like, yes, it is like the best art museum in my, and I've been to the good ones, y'all, but I love this one. You go walking through, you're like, there, it's there, and then there's another one, and you know, you just get so excited. And then to see this, to see the real thing, you know. But here you see this, it's midnight. This is called the Nighthawks. You see people, here's a guy sitting here. They don't even look like they're talking. This guy might be asking them a question or so. This dude's alone. But these were kind of popular, y'all. And then we have Georgia O'Keeffe, an amazing woman artist. I loved her stuff. I went to her museum, to her studio out there in New Mexico, and she did lots of landscapes like this, and they're just beautiful. You see the real things, y'all. There's nothing like that. To go up and see the brush strokes and And to see, on the, just to see it up close, although I get close enough, they sometimes tell me to go away and tell me I'm breathing on the picture and to get back. But I mean, they've done that before. It's kind of sad. But, so she's famous for these stark New Mexican landscapes and lots of pictures of cows. She loved cows' heads. And there are people that get into all kinds of weird stuff about these, but she liked those pictures and flowers. Here's a couple of my favorites. My wife and I use calla lilies, which is kind of weird because it's often a symbol of death, but we used it for our wedding. We had everything decorated. Everybody had that. And then here you see this beautiful red painting that I have a very large copy of at my house too. But she did lots of paintings of flowers. And there are people, y'all, if you want to get into it, they will try to dig deep into these and find sexual things in them. And I'll leave that to you guys. I don't like to think that, but these are amazing pieces of work, but they're very different. And a lot of it, like we said, it's alienation. This modern world ain't quite right. People are filling in the 20s, a lot of our artists. And so you see some